Hello and welcome to Eastern Horizon. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Today we are going to discuss about the UK MI6 chief statement towards Russia, in which she has given some very strong words and strong statements. So to discuss this, the consequences and the repercussions of the statement of the MI6 chief, and whether it is a precedent that an MI6 chief can come into the public space speeches and debates. So I have a very wonderful panel. From UK, I have joined Dr. Peter Doran. He is at the School of the Law and the Mitchell Institute, Belfast. From Germany, I have joined our very kind Dr. Ulrich Bruckner. He is a Jeans Mount professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. And from Russia, I have early recorded with a famous Russian international relation expert, Mr. Andrei Kortonov, who has his own insight on this. So thank you very much, Peter Doran and Dr. Ulrich.
Delighted to be with you, Malik. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr.
For
Ulrich.
having me.
Thank you. So let me play. I just talked a few minutes before with with Andrei Kortonov, and we will let his opinion on this, and then we can talk about this to our further program. So let's have a listen on this.
Well, I think that there is nothing particularly new in this recent statement of the new MI6 leader, because the British position towards Russia has traditionally been very tough, and there were many statements made by the British Prime Minister, by the British Foreign Secretary, by the British Secretary of Defense, so by many officials, which essentially positioned Russia as the main adversary of the United Kingdom. So I don't think that it's a change of the British approach. I think that here we see a lot of continuity with previous public statements by British officials.
But at this time, that when there is a negotiations going on towards the Ukraine, what exactly means by the UK MI6 chief that she pointed that the Russia expansionist agenda and this kind of stuff? How you see that this wording that she used at the time of this Russia-Ukraine conflict? How you see this in special?
Well, I think that we should put this statement into the proper context, and it's important to compare this statement with the language used by the Trump administration in the recently released National Security Strategy document. And the United States carefully avoids labeling Russia as a threat, as a challenge, as an adversary, as an enemy of the United States. So I think that that suggests that the transatlantic rift on Russia keeps growing. It means that the Russian side is likely to focus on trying to achieve some kind of agreement with Washington rather than with London or with Brussels. I think this is not something quite new. I think for already almost a year, Moscow has been trying to start a dialogue with Washington on the Ukrainian settlement, and there were a couple of high-level meetings, including the summit meeting in Anchorage between President Trump and President Putin. So I think that the statement made by the new British intelligence chief suggests that Russia will continue to focus on the United States rather than on Europe, be it the European Union or the United Kingdom. So I think that the current trends are likely to continue.
And how you think that in front of Russia, the statements that comes from the MI6, in terms of weightage, do you think that when there is a negotiation and there are major stakeholder, the United States and the Russia, do you think that UK has some leverage or some say of this statement in front of Russia?
Well, I think that right now there are no direct conflicts between London and Moscow on the Ukrainian settlement. I don't think that there is any dialogue, first track or second track dialogue between the two nations. So what the United Kingdom can do is to try influencing the US position. And this is what Prime Minister Starmer is already doing for some time. But as we can see, President Trump has his own positions, and he's not easy to be influenced by other state leaders. So a lot will depend on the future relations between Washington and London. But I don't think that the United Kingdom has a significant leverage, except for its continuous support of Ukraine in the conflict. But again, this support is something that has been stated more than once, and I don't think that the change of the guard in MI6 will change any substantive positions of the United Kingdom in this conflict.
Thank you very much, Henry Kortunov, for your insight. I really appreciate it. Yes, Dr. Peter Doran. So, what is your take on this, and how you see the statement from mean that the Blaise Metreweli, mean that is this a precedent in UK or it's something new?
There has been a pattern of the MI6 chief coming in from the cold, as they used to say, and appearing publicly. They have been much more open and public about their mission and their vision. And in fact, the current leader referred to her predecessors, where they have provided a tour of the major conflict and security challenges in earlier years. So it's not exceptional. And I think your guest from Moscow was spot on, really, that the statement and the focus on the conflict with Russia, or the perceived conflict with Russia, is part of a pattern of UK activity and behaviours. MI6 are reportedly actively involved in, at the very least, advising and enabling some of the interventions in the Ukrainian conflict, which have been designed to complement Keir Starmer's desire to undermine the negotiations between Trump and Putin. There's been a pattern of interventions. For example, there were leaks after the attacks on the Russian air bases by the drones, as several air bases were attacked, including those that accommodate some of their nuclear forces. Some leaks after those attacks revealed and suggested very strongly that that this was consistent with MI6 advice and planning. And as I say, was the intervention by the MI6 chief came at a very sensitive moment in the talks between Zelensky and the European leaders. So again, there's been an attempt to talk up the conflict rather than seek a diplomatic solution by the UK government.
Mm-hmm. So let me go to Dr. Ulrich. Dr. Ulrich, how you see that in Europe, the statement of the MI6 chief is being perceived, especially in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So how you analyze and how you comment on this?
Well, I think Andrei Kotonov has a point that this is part of a pattern in the United Kingdom that has been always rhetorically much more hawkish towards Russia, even before the full invasion in Ukraine. So hearing this from the MI6 chief is not a surprise, and it's certainly not a change of direction how the United Kingdom is positioned itself. I disagree, though, that there is something like a conspiracy behind it, because what we see is a fight on the battleground, and we also see a fight of conflicting narratives about who caused the conflict. Is it a conflict, or is it an invasion of Russia and Ukraine is practically an innocent victim? Or if we buy the Russian propaganda and look through the lens of what we hear from the Kremlin to make sense of what certain actors like an MI6 chief has to say about this. Generally speaking, the Europeans try to play a role in this and not just sit and wait and become condition takers. And this is also very consistent, and everyone who has an important position to share information. We see the same thing from the Russian side, that whenever there are peace talks or negotiations with Trump, there's always breaking news from the battleground that Russia has the upper hand. And the same applies to recommendations from whatever secret service or politicians in Europe to help Zelensky to make his point and to change the perspective, that in the end leads to this swinging pendulum that one day Trump buys this narrative and the next day he buys something else. But the Europeans have no motivation to keep the war going, because it's Europe that pays a high price, not as high as Ukraine as the victim, but the sanctions that the Europeans imposed on Russia always work both ways. They start to bite, so it's not a waste of money and energy and diplomatic weight, but they certainly negatively affect the European economies. And in a Western type democracy, the room for maneuver for leaders is defined by public opinion. And what we have seen from Russia since the beginning of the war, or even since the first attempts to destabilize Ukraine started and the occupation of Crimea and parts of Donbass, is that Russia wants a bigger picture and destabilize the European security order. So we have been affected from day one, and this is not a side effect or something. The whole conflict is not about Russia trying to occupy a chunk of its neighboring country. It's the largest country in the world, and it's not about territory. This is about rewriting history and restoring the dignity and pride of Russia as an empire and a global power. And that's why Russia only wants to negotiate with the United States, and everyone else ends up being a condition taker and of minor importance. But the fact that Putin constantly attacks Europeans of being the ones who do not allow to end the war shows that he gives a lot of weight to the importance of the Europeans.
So, Dr. Peter Duran, uh, we listen, Dr. Ulrich. So, I mean that how you comment that, especially the statement. What is the statement weightage inside UK? Mean that does people still have concern about Russia Ukraine inside the UK, or it's just being a statement that could be, that I could say that something like the Russian hawks or something like this? Mean that mean you understand my question, because the existence challenges that UK have So do you think that this statement, what means for the common UK people?
Well, I picked up the Financial Times yesterday to see the reporting, expecting to see the report, the coverage given some prominence. Um, and I was surprised actually it didn't appear on the front page. It seems to have just been taken as another signal from the UK government that it's business as usual in terms of talking up the threat from Russia, which is dismissed by Putin consistently. Um, and also, I mean, I would say that the public reaction is probably largely influenced by the compliance of the mainstream media with the narrative that somehow the attack on Ukraine was unprovoked. That narrative is challenged by very well regarded academics, people like Professor Jeffrey Sachs and John Melsheimer. The narrative that somehow the Russians decided overnight to seize territory for no reason is a reversal of the comments, or it stands on their head the comments by the MI6 chief, who suggested that somehow the conflict arose because of harassment of NATO by Russia. It was the abandonment of promises made not to extend NATO eastwards after the fall of the German, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The promises made not to expand NATO eastwards that led directly to the provocations. And these statements about provoking Russia, leading to its dismemberment, are on record. You know, this was part of the intention of the neocons, and it has now, in a rather pathetic way, been taken up by senior politicians in the European Union.
Hmm.
So I often characterize it. It's a bit like a Gordian knot. It's true that there are competing narratives, and people are kind of hoist on their own petard. They're unable to, having talked their own publics uh, into believing these fictions and these competing narratives. They're unable to step back now and acknowledge that there's much more going on. It's a much more complex history, and
Hmm.
that the US, the neocons, and some of the vassal states in Europe have been part of the provocation that led directly to these events, and they really need now to use diplomatic channels to come to a solution rather than simply hiding their heads in the sand.
Hmm. Hmm. So, Dr. Ulrich, we saw that some European leaders they gathered in UK a few weeks before in solidarity with Ukraine, and then we saw this statement. So, how you think that the European leaders are in a position to listen? Mean that UK mean that the point of view or UK interest in these peace negotiations. So, how much margin they have that the UK could play some role or some suggestion into this Russia-Ukraine conflict that comply by Europeans.
Well, as Peter just pointed out, this is not about a bilateral conflict because it is part of a bigger picture of what is our global order, what is international law, what is the concept of sovereignty, and the quoted Peter Mearsheimer believes that there are only a few sovereign states because they are powerful enough to make the others do what they want. And in such a world, Ukraine is not considered to be sovereign, and the European Union is a burden to the United States. So if we transform the Europeans into condition takers by defining influential zones, the West follows what the United States wants, and the East follows what Russia wants, then we have a different security order, if you want to call it security order, And this is what we are currently discussing and why the Europeans support Ukraine in its right for self-defense. These are fundamentally different concepts compared with a sovereignty-based system in which the state is free to decide what concept of collective security it wants to be part of. And therefore, NATO expansion is the wrong term. NATO is a security organization. If it still happens to exist, that's a different discussion. But assuming that it provides collective security, then any state in Europe is free to decide if it applies for membership and if the organization decides that it wants this new country to be part of, no matter if it once belonged to the Soviet Union, like the Baltic states, or in the future, Ukraine. But I think at this point, it's irrelevant for Ukraine to aim for NATO membership because since February, we know that NATO doesn't work the way it was designed because the Americans believe that Europeans aren't worth being defended. If they provide security, then it has to be transactional. So if the Europeans pay, they might get something in return. And that's also part of the ongoing negotiations about providing security guarantees. But there is no Article 5 automatic procedure that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. So the consequence for the Europeans is that they only have a say if they get their act together and use their collective weight to influence the outcomes, because no matter what the result is, it will directly affect the security situation for the whole European continent and not just for the people in Ukraine. And therefore, they do play a role. They should also play a role according to the wish list of the Russians with the 28 points that the Europeans should pay after the end of the military invasion. And therefore, no matter how the final result should be, all parties involved should have a say and accept the consequences. And it wouldn't work to agree on something over the heads of Ukraine or the Europeans. And that's why they have a say and they will make the point, and in what practical form that ends, whether they sit at a negotiation table or whether they sign a peace agreement or something, that's completely secondary. What matters most is that their role must be recognized, and it is recognized. We have seen this in Geneva, and we have seen this on Monday in Berlin, and it continues to play a role in whatever comes up as a ceasefire and then hopefully a lasting peace solution.
Mm. Dr. Peter Doran, mean that how you see Russia-Ukraine conflict with a UK lens? Mean that do you think that is this going to be an end? How you see? Mean that your personal observations and your analysis on this.
Well, I think I agree that the complexity of any discussion about the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine has to be seen through the lens or understood through the lens of a deeply unstable period, and it's a period of deep transition in the nature of geopolitics. The new security strategy from the US is quite explicitly talking about the return of the Monroe Doctrine, pursuing again the right to influence what they call their backyard in Latin America. So there's an intervention virtually in Venezuela about to take place. They're already the Americans are already taking an oil cargo ship and throwing international law and compliance with any international standards of behavior to the wind. So the larger questions of a rules-based order, who that rules-based order serves, is really on the table here. And that's why there's a conflicting narrative, a set of conflicting narratives around the role of Russia, and where Ukraine sits within the new emergent European security architecture that Putin says he wants to support and enable. He wants a legal order that would secure and make predictable relationships in the future with Ukraine and the rest of Europe. Um,
Hmm.
but the uncertainties and the behaviours of some of both the British and the European politicians seems to be mixed up with a larger sense of uncertainty because of the withdrawal of interest and strategic guarantees by their U.S. masters, the people the U.S. have set down the rules and the conditions and largely resourced the
Hmm.
umbrella for the Europeans. And within the context of the uncertainties of that American change towards a more transactional position, the abandonment of probably the so-called special relationship with the UK, it has produced a set of rather irrational responses, I think, in terms of the conflict with Russia and the interests in arriving at a peaceful settlement that acknowledges that all parties have contributed to, provoked, and threatened the others through their actions especially after the expansion of NATO and the expansion of Europe eastwards.
Hmm. Dr. Ulrich, my last question, that MI6 chief mentioned in her speech, quote, aggressive expansionist. So, do you think that this comment will be by the European leaders in context of NATO expansionist agenda?
Well, we are not talking about a philosophical question. We are talking about a very different reality on the ground, in which war is not just you declare it and then you send troops with the codes of arms and the official positions that you can identify as official troops of an aggressor that attacks another country. What we see are forms in a gray zone in which Putin tests the ability of the Europeans to respond to destroyed cables under sea and critical infrastructure and cyber attacks and drones over airports and forms of propaganda and fake news campaigns supporting right-wing extremist parties that help to destabilize the discourse and spread the fear in public opinion. So all of this is already happening while we speak, and it's not something that might happen in the future if the MI6 chief is right, but this is our daily reality. You only need to read the news. And Putin is happily playing with this ideal that the Europeans are destabilized, and if in the end they might attack Russia, then he can't wait to show the might of the Russian army that in Ukraine is only operating with surgical precision, as he pointed out. While in the future, he would not dare to consider a nuclear option, and in the end, he has no one to communicate with. This is the level of provocation and flirting with ideas of pretending that Russia is as mighty as he wished it to be. And this is something in the public discourse in Europe that affects the positioning of the different parties in an open pluralist society in which everyone is free to think and draw conclusions from such provocations. So, of course, it affects the negotiations today at the European Council in Brussels, in which the European leaders have to define a compromise between the national interests of Brussels, where the frozen assets are held, and the collective share of risks in trying to support Ukraine financially to keep going and not economically collapse as a consequence of the Russian aggression. That's the situation we are currently in. And it's not about maybe in the future it might happen. We are in the middle of a hybrid conflict with Russia.
Mm. Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Doran from Belfast and Dr. Ulrich from Germany. I really appreciate your insight. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Malik. Good to be with you.
For having